So Amy, you're a coach here with me, and you and I have worked together for, gosh, I think 20 years now.
Yeah, it
at a
hardly
co-
seems possible.
I know, across a couple different companies, and you've been a coach pretty much for the bulk of that time. And so we thought today it'd be fun to get together and talk about systematizing an advisor's office. Of course, this is an area that in recent years, technology has been a big help in. And so we're going to be talking about both from a technology standpoint, how that can help systematize things, and then also, I'd say, the good old fashioned checklist idea as well. So we can talk about whether that still makes sense in this technology obsessed world. So I thought I'd start off just by setting a little context here in terms of how I think about systematizing an office. And I'd love to get your take on this as well. And so the way I think about it is, to me, there's a big difference between systems thinking and putting systems in place. And it's similar to the idea or the difference between a strategy and a tactic. So if you're thinking about your business and you're thinking about, okay, well, if we want to grow our business, what are some of the tactics that we can use? Well, we could start doing YouTube videos, or we could start doing digital marketing, or we could ramp up referral marketing. So there's lots of different tactics that we could do to make that happen. But ultimately, we really want to start with a strategy. We want to figure out what is the big picture here of what we're trying to accomplish and what direction we're trying to head. And so then once you have the strategy, then you can figure out, all right, what are the specific tactics that are going to make sense for us to actually execute on this strategy or this bigger picture vision of what we're driving toward. So to me, systems thinking and putting systems in place is basically the same thing. So to me, systems thinking is about thinking about your business as a whole and understanding that everything in the business is connected. So you can't really change one thing in one part of the business and think, well, that's not going to affect any other part of the business, because ultimately they are all connected in one way or another. So I think we have to start with this idea of a systems mindset and understanding that everything that we do in our business is going to be connected. So let's just start with that as sort of an overall idea. And then once we understand that, then I think we can start going into the specifics of, okay, do we need to have a system for onboarding a new client, or do we need to have a system for how do we handle a referral, and 100 or 1,000 other types of systems that we could put in place. So Amy, let me just stop there and see if you have any thought on that as well.
Absolutely. Everything you just said there, and certainly my preparation for today has been about really looking at the tactical side of things. But you're right. You have to have your strategy in place. You have to know where it is you want to go with your firm before you start putting systems. Because I'm going to talk today probably about a lot of different systems you could put in place, or use examples, but that may not be right for your firm. And so these are simply ways to look at this as a way of putting a framework around how you put systems in place. So it is really what you just said is perfectly articulated, that it really is about knowing your firm, what you want to do, and then putting the systems in place that support it behind it.
Another thing related to this is this idea of structure. And this is a concept that I learned from Robert Fritz. And Robert Fritz, I spent a number of days studying with him a number of years ago. And he's one of the foremost thinkers on structural thinking, systems thinking. And one of the things that he talked about was this idea of the path of least resistance. And I think this really applies to systems thinking as well, in that if you think about how energy moves, energy is going to move along the path of least resistance. So that's really one of I mean, it's not his insight, but in terms of how he thinks about this idea of structural thinking, that's one of the ideas, that anything is going to follow its path of least resistance. And then another one of his insights is that the underlying structure of anything is going to determine the path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about a river and how a river flows, well, it flows according to the underlying structure of the riverbed. And so if you want to change how the river is going to flow, then you need to change the underlying structure, or you need to change the riverbed, and then the river is going to flow in a different way. And then the third thing that he talked about was that we can determine the path of least resistance by creating new structures. And so if we think about those three insights, I think those are very much related to systems thinking and putting systems in place as well, in that if we want to change the behavior in the organization and we want people to start using systems, then we've got to figure out how can we make putting systems in place and using systems, how can we make that become the new path of least resistance, as opposed to just saying, hey, you need to start using this system, or you need to use this checklist, or you need to use this workflow. We need to figure out how can we change the underlying structure of the organization such that that becomes sort of the new default mode of how we're going to operate. And one way to do that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Amy, if you've got some other ideas as well, is to think about what gets, say, rewarded in the organization. What is the type of behavior that gets reinforced? And so if you want to have a systems thinking culture and a systems using culture, then we need to make sure that the culture is designed such that it's going to reward, it's going to incent, it's going to recognize people that are using the systems and exhibiting the kinds of behavior that we want to see. And then, of course, we got to make sure that that path of least resistance to using the systems is indeed the path of least resistance. And so let me just stop there. Any comments on that, Amy?
Yeah, one thing that came to mind is, and it's a little off topic, but in that realm, is just you have to have the why behind putting systems in place. And there's many reasons. We want to free up the advisor's time. The advisor often thinks, I am the only one who can do this. I'm the best at that. And it's not always the case. I mean, there's some things, certainly investment management, financial planning, some of those things definitely need to fall in the advisor's lap, at least as you're building your firm. But the freedom of the advisor. I once had an advisor who told me that I want to run an Ironman or do an Ironman, but I don't have the time to train for it. And I said, well, why don't we put systems in place to allow your team to be able to take that time? And he was able to do many Ironmans since then, continues to do them. And, it was just a great way for him to be able to free up that time. But it also allows your team to have more confidence, because that confidence that they then have in the ownership of being able to understand why I'm doing this, how it fits in the big picture, because it does. I can't just write a system that says, here's how you open the office, but yet I don't tell you why that's important. That's part of the experience. So tying that all together. And I mean, even from a compliance purpose, this is an important part to remember, is that having systems in place allow you to avoid things like fines. If you don't do an RMD for a client, they can get fined. If you don't put in place some of the systems to make sure you're doing a client review, you could have the SEC come back on you, or even as a broker dealer, making sure you know your client. So there's a lot of reasons why putting these systems in place really help you to elevate your firm in a way. And I'm going to take a comment from a friend of ours that you'll know is we want to systemize the ordinary so we can deliver the extraordinary. You don't want to have to spend a lot of, I've heard the word calories. You want to make it simple. You don't want to have to expend a lot of calories on what do I do when we bring in a new client or a new a prospect into the firm. I want to be able to just go through that so I can spend the calories and spend the energy and deliver the extraordinary through the other things that are that may pop up and give you that experience.
Yeah, and I love the examples there, and that quote there, sort of a variation, is we want to systematize the predictable so we can humanize the unpredictable. And by putting the systems in place, we know stuff is going to happen that is unexpected. But when we've got the systems in place, we know the normal stuff's going to be taken care of, while we can then attend to the thing that is causing some disruption. So I think that's a great way to think about it. And then the example about the person who was doing the Ironman. The way that I think about it is structure produces behavior. And along those lines, what I do is I exercise pretty much every day. And to try and make exercise the path of least resistance, I put my exercise clothes out the night before, and it's pretty much in my path to get out of my bedroom. And so I'm basically going to trip over this. So I can't avoid it. So I'm trying to make that the path of least resistance. Now, the reality is I don't mind exercising. I actually look forward to it because the kind of exercising I do is pretty much getting outside and doing stuff. So I enjoy it. I get a chance to listen to podcasts. So I guess that's another thing that I do too, is like this morning, I was out for a nice hike out in the woods, and I was listening to podcasts, and I probably should just be enjoying nature. And I do that sometimes too. But to me, the path of least resistance is I really look forward to getting out and hiking and listening to a podcast. So to me, it's like I've created that structure that makes me look forward to wanting to get out and exercising in the morning. So whatever it is that you're doing in your practice, in your personal life, whatever we can do to create those structures that make it easy for you to do the behavior that you want to do is how we're going to actually be more successful in the things that we do. So appreciate you sharing that example. All right, let's talk about some specifics then in terms of actually systematizing the office. And I know when you and I worked together back at Peak Advisor Alliance, which is now Carson Coaching, you were our head systems person. You put together all the systems manuals. You trained all of the operations people at our client advisory firms, in addition to coaching. And so walk me through, if you would, how you think about where do we start in terms of if we want to put systems in place, where do we start?
Yeah, I think one of the places we start is just understanding the vernacular that I'm going to use or you're going to use in your own firm, because you could call it standard operating procedures. I think Traction calls it the way. I think there's, systems and checklists and processes and workflows. So they're all different terms that can define the same thing. But I have a very specific way that I actually like to think about it. And I'd love to go through that with you today, if that's okay.
Please do.
All right. Well, so the first thing I really like to look at is the term process. And one thing you mentioned is technology can help streamline all of our processes. And absolutely, I want people to be able to use the technology that's available. But one thing I will mention is that you can't just jump into the technology. You still have to understand what your process is. So basically a process is the steps that are required to complete an activity. So in this particular case, maybe an example would be your client review process. So the client review process is an example of an activity that you might go through. The process to go through that might look something like, you schedule the appointment, you prepare for that appointment, you hold the appointment, and you follow up. So that would be an example of what a process might look like. And that's such an important part. You have to understand the overall where you're starting before you dig into the details. And the reason I do this kind of in this format, and I really call this the streamlined operations strategy, it's a 5-step creating the process. That's step one. The second part of it is creating a checklist. So the checklist is going to go a little deeper, and really that's going to identify your tasks. What tasks are needed to complete each of those steps in the process? The system would be the third step, and the third step is just how each of those tasks is completed within each step of that process. And I'll go through an example of what a difference between a checklist and a system is. I think that'll be helpful in that. But then once you finally decide what your process is, what the checklist look like, what the system is, you then can look at what's the delivery system? How is it you're going to create a repeatable way to deliver on those checklist systems processes? And that's when we'll get into some of the technology. And then finally, train. This is one of the most important steps and often gets missed. I've created something called the TOR method, which is basically T is for train, O is for observe. So really after you've shown them how to use a system, it's then looking at how are they doing that? Are they doing it correctly? Assessing, which really just means spot checking, looking at what they're doing and are they completing it in a fashion that is accomplishing what you want, and then refreshing. And the refreshing part is giving them the ownership to make changes to that system. And so that's kind of how I go through that 5-step process, going five-part strategy really of the process, checklist, system, delivery, and then train. And this can really be used anytime you're creating any system. This is how I want to start that process and that strategy of getting through that.
Yeah, and I love how you started out with really specifying or creating the actual process. And if I understood you correctly, you're basically saying, hey, we've got to identify what is the best way to actually do this. So let's make sure we figure that out first
Right.
before we spend any time or money using technology to automate it or using a checklist to make sure that we don't miss a step or something. So we got to make sure, let's get the process right first before any of that
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that is such a key, because if you automate a bad process, not a good thing.
Not a good thing. It's a waste of everybody's time and energy, and probably some finances as well, because it can be costly to put some of the different technology items in place.
So I want to go through these 5 steps and then this tour methodology that you mentioned here in just a moment. But let's zoom out again for a minute.
Mhm.
So I remember back in the peak days, we had, I think there was like 9 categories in the systems manual. So
Yes.
it was like, new clients, review meetings, client leaving, whatever. So are there some broad categories that you think about and say, if you're doing a table of contents for your systems manual, how do you break down that table of contents?
So 5 seems to be my number today for all of this.
Okay.
So there are 5 areas I actually put this into, and it really just helps to identify the blocks that you might be looking in. So each of them can be broken down further, but at a high level, um, one would be bringing in new clients. So what you do, all the parts of bringing in new clients, that's going to look at things such as how do you attract new clients? That's going to include marketing, but also how do you convert that prospect to a new client? And that's more the sales side. So bringing on new clients is the first area. The second area would be wowing your existing clients. And that's going to really look at how do you deliver that consistent experience, both efficiently and effectively to all levels of your clients throughout that client relationship. So that's 2. 3 would be mastering the mechanics. And this is kind of where the word operations is best used. So how does your firm deliver aspects of operations that are a part of your firm's offering? So that could be things like your investments, financial planning, fees, opening and closing accounts, those sorts of things. We got building the team. So we can't forget building that team to have the best people in place. But part of building the team is how do you attract, train them, and then retain them, those great people that you're able to attract. And then the fourth, or the fifth, is tracking your numbers. As an advisor, you still need to be able to track your success. And that could be in the areas of your goals, revenue, expenses, profit margins, new clients, referrals, all of those different things that you track. And it's not just tracking for your own benefit, but it's also tracking for your team's benefit. You want to be able to show them the success you're having with the firm, or maybe areas where you're falling behind a little bit and need to maybe rethink some ways to be better in those areas.
Okay, Amy, I'm an advisor. I'm listening to this and I think, oh, this is overwhelming. Where do I start? And is there, some people will think of this as sort of maybe the front stage and the backstage, or client facing and non-client facing. So some folks might say, hey, let's start with the systems that affect the clients first, because maybe we can get some quick victories there. And after all, they're paying the bills. So let's make sure that we start there. How do you typically recommend that an advisor start or actually enhance any systems that they have in place? Where do we start?
Yeah, I'm going to take that right back to the strategy versus tactical part of the opening conversation here. Is it really depends on the firm. I'm working with a coaching client right now, and yeah, usually I would say let's start with the prospect process, because that's what brings the money to the firm, at least in a way that we can look at that way and measure. But he was really wanting to look a little bit more at just the client experience. So wowing your clients. So it was getting, the client the client service matrix in place, and now putting systems in place for how you deliver each of those. So first it was finding what it is he wants to deliver, and then now putting the systems behind it and going through different ways to do that. So it still starts with, what does the advisor want in their firm? It's not, yes, I could say, okay, start with prospecting, then go to your existing clients and move through the process in a particular way. It really is, what is the thing of highest importance to the firm at this time? If you're in the process of hiring somebody, then we're probably going to start with, let's put some systems in place as we're going through the hiring process, because that's the easiest way, is when you're going through the process, is to start writing some of those systems. And it doesn't have to be pen to paper. It doesn't have to be typing all this up in a nice format. You could take your phone and record a note and say, okay, here's my parts of the hiring process. I'm going to, look for people. I'm going to hire people. I'm going to review resumes and go through those things and just voice record it. Okay, I'm going through the interview process. Here's the questions I want to ask. And then that can be notated later into more of a written system.
Like a lot of things in life, it depends.
Absolutely.
um, So you mentioned, like, how do we sort of capture some of these ideas? You said you can just like type or speak a voice note into your phone. Of course, we have artificial intelligence now, and I
Yeah.
continue to be amazed every day that I'm using AI as to what it can do. And you can actually use AI to make a first draft of your system. So just start playing with ChatGPT or Claude.ai or a couple of the biggies out there, and Google's got Gemini as well. And I would say with those big three there, and I would use all of them, and I would take the same prompt and I would put it in all three of them and just see what kind of response that you get, because each of them is going to be a little bit better in certain things. And you never really know which one is going to be better at what things. So oftentimes I'll take the same prompt, I'll put it in all three and see which one gives me the best answer. So,
Right.
so yeah, you can use these AI systems to actually create a first draft of your systems. They'll put them in a nice chart, tabular format, and the more specific your prompt, the better response you're going to get. And then, of course, from there, you're going to want to do your own editing, and you're going to want to personalize it for your practice. But I think that's a good way to start there as well.
Yeah, and I actually did that with the client review system. Not that I had an overall idea of where I wanted to go and the steps I needed. So I didn't go in depth into what are the specific systems or tasks, but the checklist they can help with, or even the high level process. And so I think that was great. So if I'm asking the question, I'm a financial advisor and I'm looking for creating a checklist of those items to help me as I'm scheduling a client review, what would you recommend those steps be? And so, yes, it absolutely can find some of those things and things you may not have thought of, because it's just something you do. It's something you do over and over and over, and you forget about some of those little things. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot I got to schedule a conference room when I have a client review if they're in person, and make sure that nobody else is in that room at the time.
Well, speaking of forgetting things, that's one reason why we want to use a checklist. So I think that was number 2 in your 5-step process here. So the first one being to create the process. Second is to create the checklist. So tell me about, when should we use a checklist versus using technology to have something automated?
Absolutely. Yep. So one thing I look at with checklist systems is, I'm going to use an example here, or an analogy, because I think most people have probably baked cookies at some point in their life, chocolate chip cookies, for instance. Put a process together with that, and it might be something like prepare. And that prepare would look like, we need to make sure we have the ingredients that we need, the recipe, and we have maybe we get the butter softened. We then mix the cookies together. We bake them. We taste them, because that's the most important step. And then we clean up. So that's kind of your process you follow. What we then would look at as we're getting into more the checklist is looking at something like your ingredients or your recipe itself. Your recipe is 2 parts. It's an ingredient list, which is what you need to put in that mix. And then you have your instructions. So as a person who's baked cookies a few times, I just need the ingredient list. I don't necessarily need the checklist that goes, or the instructions, because I know what I cook the oven on. I know what to look like if they're ready. I know the time it takes. So those are things that I don't need. But as I was walking my stepson through this the first time and kind of taking him through making chocolate chip cookies, he would have put the oven on 500 and baked them for, 2 minutes, and they'd have been nice and gooey or crispy. And that wouldn't have worked. So if you think about it, a checklist is a great way to really be for that person who's done the job many times. And then the system or the instructions are more for the person who they're kind of a beginner at this, or we need to have additional instructions. So I broke down, and actually I have a couple of examples I can share at the end of this call. A client review checklist. It's a paper document, so happy to share that. And I have a client review system as well. And so on that, when we show that to you, we're going to have things like in the checklist, it'll be schedule your client review, and the items are there was identify who's
Well,
due
let's
for
let's
review.
pull that
Okay,
up,
go ahead.
actually.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can do that.
Yeah, let's pull that up. So for
let
those of
me
you
share my
watching this on
screen
video, you'll be able to see it.
and share screen. Sure, I can. There it is. All right. I'll just do a little sample here. So this is just a sample of what that checklist might look like. So we'd pull things like the schedule your client review would have identify which clients are due or overdue for that client review. We'll share the list with your advisor or any notes just to see if there's anybody or any specific instructions that you need before you call the client to schedule it. Reach out to the client to schedule with some times potentially they're available, and then place that on the calendar. So that's a high level what you would do to schedule a client review. The checklist then is going to look, or the system is going to look more like this. So specifically, if we're talking about reaching out to the client to schedule, you're going to look at some things like what days of the week are you going to schedule it? More detail. Don't schedule more than 3 meetings a day. Scheduling the conference room, allow 30 minutes before and after. What are some of those specifics to scheduling a call that is specific to your firm? And this is just an example of a few. So again, checklist is more the basics of I need to do this, and this, this, and this, where the system is going to give you more of the specific instructions around that.
So one of the frustrations that I have heard from advisors for 30 years is, yeah, I want systems in place. I try and encourage my team to put the systems in place, but then the advisor has no good system to figure out if the systems are actually being followed and where in the process something is. So if it's like onboarding a new client, for example, how can the advisor get a good snapshot of where we're at with Mr. and Mrs. Jones coming on as a new client? How do they're like, I don't know where we're at in the process or if it's even been done. I just trust that it's happening.
Right. Well, and I think that's where it comes into how is it you're delivering? I think this is step 4 in the process, is really just how are you delivering this? And basically by delivery, I mean, what is the repeatable way you're going to do this? So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen once more and pull this up for you. So I really look at this as 5 different items. I think I have 5 here as well. 5 is my favorite number, evidently.
It is. 5 is the number of the day.
Of the day, exactly. Better go play the lottery. So one of the ways is the system, the printed system and checklist that I have. And so you ask, how might the advisor know? Well, they're going to have to find the person.
So now what we're seeing here, you're showing the delivery options and you're saying this is in the order of complexity. Okay, that's right. So the first one you're saying is the least complex.
Least complex in the setup, I guess, would be the way I would say that. So it's the least complex in the setup of the using a paper system. So using a paper. So in my opinion, what a great way of using a paper is, you've created the system, you print it out, you're checking off those items as you're going through it. If it goes from one person to the next person, it's whoever's desk it's on. It's hard for the advisor to find that. Obviously, they're going to have to maybe go to everybody's desk. And I will give you one hint. I prefer not to put that paper ever on the advisor's desk. If at all possible, the team member can check in on with the advisor to see if they've performed that, but try not to put that document on their desk. It probably will get lost in the shuffle. But a printed document is one way. And then when you're done with the printed document, if you're doing something like the client review, like we were talking about, when that's completed, that goes in the client's file. So you've got a
Now in
paper trail.
reality though, Amy, in this day and age, is anybody using a printed checklist like this that's going from desk to desk?
I would say yes. As we've both worked with financial advisors long enough to know that there are some that are more tech savvy than others. And this is a beginning way. It's not the
Okay,
best way, but it's a beginning way. And
got it.
as I said earlier, curating the paper document is a great way to document anything before you get to some of the other ways. The next way would be just a fillable PDF. So it's a step higher. You'd keep an electronic copy of that. Basically, you check them off, you email it to somebody else, they check off their things, and then you ultimately electronically file that in the client's electronic file. So it's a little step up, a little bit more to manage, got to be a little more knowledgeable about setting up PDFs and fillable ones, but it works well to keep everything on your computer so you can find it easily. Another one might be videos. And videos are something, we've used, Steve, over the years, helping advisors to understand, how to go through this. You could have one person on a Zoom recording their steps that they're taking, showing how you do that. The difficulty there is if you need to make changes, it's a little bit more complicated unless you have video editing expertise.
So
But it
that'd be
does.
something like using Loom, I think is one of the systems, and there's others out there where you basically, or you can even use Zoom
You could
as an
Zoom. Yeah.
example. Yeah, just sharing the screen, videoing your screen, and walking through a piece of software, describing something. So yeah,
Yep.
that's definitely pretty easy to do these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next one I'm using is project management software. And this is a way to not have to go into your CRM, because that's going to be the last step here. But your project management software might be something like Monday, Basecamp, Asana. All of those allow you to create templates. So if you wanted to create a template for the client review process, you pull up that template, you name it something for that particular client and date it, and then the advisor could see what progress is being made and what steps. Reminders can go to the individuals who are assigned to those tasks. And so again, it's another way of being able to do that. But my favorite way, if you have the time, the resources, and the expertise, is automating a workflow. And that I know how to do that a little bit in both Redtail and Salesforce. They both have good ways to do similar to what the project management software is, but it's within the same system. It's in your CRM, so it's attached to your client. You can see what's outstanding on the workflow, who's the next task that needs to be done, if anything's past due. So I think the delivery option is, to answer your question, that was a long answer, but that is how I think the advisor would check up on some of these things, and that is definitely recommended. That's part of the final step of the strategy, is really that training, and you have to assess, is it working? Are they doing things? Let's just say one example might be when you bring on a new client, you're probably going to assign them to a tier, segmenting them. Going back and checking on that periodically to make sure that that step of the process is being done is a way to say, okay, yep, it looks like they're going through it, or going to the system itself. But I think there's always checks and balances there that need to take place to make sure that those are being adhered to.
Yeah, one other one I would add to the list here as well is using a shared spreadsheet. So it could be Google
Absolutely.
Docs. I've got a number of advisor clients that I work with where they'll have a Google spreadsheet and they'll use that as sort of their
Yeah.
online checklist. So rather than just a printed checklist, they're just going to use a Google sheet. So that might be
Yep.
similar to number one. Instead of printed, it's an online checklist using a spreadsheet that is shared with the appropriate people on the team. And that one I think is very, very easy as well. Very convenient. It's
Yep.
convenient for the advisor as well, because they could be off in Tahiti and they could just log in and see where something is at in the process if all they have to do is look at a Google spreadsheet. So I think that's another relatively easy way to do it too.
Absolutely.
All right. So I think the fifth one here was the training. So how do we train people to follow systems and
Absolutely.
use systems?
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, I call it the TOR method. And if you would like, I can share that as well. I should have just left it up. And here we go. So yeah, first one is train. So a team member needs to be aware there's even a system in place. So often I've seen advisors put systems in place, but doesn't tell anybody that a system has been written, or the entire team doesn't know that it even exists. So that if they are covering for somebody who might be out of the office, they need to be aware, even though they may not day to day need to use the checklist, they may need to use the system and pull that up when somebody is out of the office or somebody is unexpectedly out of the office. So training just means taking them through that system, showing them what it's for, when you might use it, how you use it, if it's a format that they haven't used before. And so the training part is kind of you showing them. The next part of that would be observing. So really sharing the system with them, telling them, hey, I have a new prospect. Let's test the system out, and you watch them do it. So the second part of it is observing them going through it. You might see some holes then that you need to refresh the system or make some updated changes to make it more clear, or things that you just know to do that, hey, I didn't put it in the system. For me, it was natural, but we need to add it in there. So observing them. The next part is that assessing part. And that's really just confirming that it's being used correctly, consistently, and things are getting checked off or completed in a way that you want it to be done, but also allowing for the last part of that is refresh. And that's allowing that team member to make changes to the system. They probably are in a position to understand maybe better ways to do things. If you've always done them one way, you may not think of, oh gosh, I didn't even think of, Google Docs. Great example there, Steve. But allowing that team member to take some ownership in that and how it's performed, as long as they're getting to, those things on the checklist and those things are being completed, you don't have to dictate every step and order they do things in. Give them that freedom to really make it their own and build that confidence in their position.
One of the things that I like to do when I'm working with an advisor and we're talking about trying to systematize things is when you're hiring a new team member, is to the person that is actually going to be training that team member is to have the new hire actually take notes and essentially sort of recreate the system, because I think it helps when they're actually trying to write this stuff down and they're trying to sort of recreate the system themselves. So it's one thing to just hear or see how to do something, but it's a completely different thing if you actually have to physically like write this out or create the checklist. Now, maybe it's sort of duplicating the system that's already in place, but I think there's a lot of value in having a new team member actually work through the thing themselves, because now they're going to start thinking, okay, does this logically make sense how this is organized or the steps here and that sort of thing? So they may even be in a position to point out something that you hadn't noticed because they're coming at it with fresh eyes. And they may have a whole different perspective on this thing, and they may be able to point something out that could actually enhance the system. So I think there's a huge opportunity to really enhance your systems when you've got a new hire coming on board here.
Oh, absolutely. And it not only is it a great way to train a new associate to help say, hey, part of what, one of your first responsibilities is going to be writing a system for this thing I'm training you on right now. I can share with you what I have, but I want you to certainly, take notes, make changes, ask questions, because that's the only way we're going to make it better. And I would say this is probably one of the reasons why I'm a successful coach, is because I've had that opportunity to, as I was observing the Carson Wealth systems, really digging deep into those items, understanding how they did things, questioning why, making changes as I thought maybe this would be a better way overall for maybe our coaching members at that point to do things, because I'd seen it done successfully with other advisors. So it is a wonderful way to learn. This is great for delegation too, Steve. I mean, that's another thing that many advisors struggle with, is when do I delegate, or letting go, taking some of that control. Having a system, or saying I have a need to get a system created when you're delegating to somebody, that's a perfect time to get that system written as well, because you're going to be going through the steps with them, how you want it done or how you do it, letting them create a system so that not only can they do it, but somebody else could potentially pick it up. And one thing we haven't talked about, and you mentioned, I think, bonusing people earlier or rewarding them. Putting systems in place is time consuming. I am not underestimating that at all. So if you're doing any sort of bonus based pay with your team, this is a great thing to put as a goal. Create the system for, maybe it's all of the, bringing in a new client. And so all of those systems are the first quarter. We want to get those completed, and that is a bonus for them. So don't forget the reward part of it, because this is a time consuming process and something that one is going to be rewarding to them personally to be able to complete it. And then for you, just to have it done so that you have peace of mind that the systems are being adhered to.
This idea of rewarding reminded me of an old story from someone that you and I know, Fritz and Sue Bronner. So Fritz and Sue, if you're listening, hello. They go back to the early 1990s. And when I first met them at Securities America, and then they became members of the Peak Advisor Alliance coaching program. And I remember Fritz telling me one time that back in the day, we had this thing called the 6 most important. And if anyone has read the book Tested in the Trenches, you'll know what we're talking about. But essentially, it's each day before you leave the office, or in this case, before you log off Zoom at home, you write down the 6 most important things that you need to accomplish the next day in order of priority. And then you leave it on the top of your desk. So what Fritz and Sue did one time when they came back from vacation is they walked around the office and they looked to see who had their 6 most important sitting on the top of their desk. And for every person that did, they got $100 bill as a little bit of a reward for, quote, following the system. And so, yeah, definitely you can give people a little bit of an incentive from time to time to follow the system. And again, it gets back to that idea of what's the structure that you've created in the organization? What's the path of least resistance that you've created in the organization that's going to drive the desired behavior? And so anything that we can do to put those structures in place, to put those incentives in place, to put those guardrails in place, to put those reinforcing systems in place is going to help you get the behavior that you're trying to get there.
Absolutely. Great people.
What would you say is one of the biggest impediments or the most difficult aspects of trying to create a systems thinking culture, or trying to get these systems actually not only created, but actually being used on a day-to-day basis?
I would say probably one of the biggest things I've heard, and as you mentioned, I did do a lot of the training with the team members of the advisors that I also coached. The team members are often hesitant to put systems in place because they are fearful that that's going to replace them. And that seems like such a strange thing. It's like, no, this is going to make your life more efficient. This is going to be something that's going to allow you to spend your time on much, more interesting things instead of recreating the wheel every time. But team members think that if you put a system in place, somebody else, any Jack and Mary off the street, can come in and put that in, use that. And that's not true. I mean, there is definitely, as you mentioned, there's the expertise that comes with a lot of these positions, and everything can't be written into a system. There are things that are going to come up that are unexpected. So overcoming, this comes down to making sure that you're giving positive feedback where deserved with your team members. Sharing that if you're asking them, if you're delegating something to them or asking them to start doing this part of the system, it's because, share with them the why. Why is it you want to share this with them? Or why do you think this is a great fit for them in something that you've seen that they do that's valuable to the firm, that they excel at, and why you hope that this is a stepstone to maybe something moving them forward in their position.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. In fact, I was just having a similar conversation here earlier this week with an advisor about this idea of, should you be indispensable to your organization? And what I was arguing, well, not arguing, but what I was saying is that if you are indispensable to your organization, you're going to limit the future of your organization because you're going to become the bottleneck and everything is going to have to run through you. And the business is going to be limited by you and by your capacity. And so the way that I think about that is that any individual within the organization needs to be dispensable, but the organization itself needs to be indispensable to its clients.
Yeah.
And so to your point about if you make yourself dispensable in your current job, what that does is it gives you the ability to move up and move on to the next thing and further your career, get additional training so that you can now get really good at that thing, make yourself dispensable there to move up to the next rung. So it's sort of this virtuous circle here where you can keep improving and adding new skills and capabilities so that you can continue to grow. And, we've mentioned our old company, Peak Advisor Alliance 2 or 3 times here. And, I feel that's essentially what I did there after having worked there for 11 or 12 years. We put a great team in place. We had you, we had Laura Pearson, we had a whole bunch of people that were just phenomenal in their job. And I felt like I sort of made myself dispensable at that point because I had such great people in place. And so it was a pretty smooth transition when I decided it was time for me to go do something new. So yeah, I think that is, to me, is one sign of great leadership, that if you can foster that kind of culture and environment where people can make themselves dispensable in their job, then that gives them the ability to continue to grow. And to bring this back to the systems, as you were saying, it's absolutely nothing to be afraid of or to feel threatened by. Just like artificial intelligence. I mean, there's still people that, that feel threatened, and certainly people will lose their job as a result of artificial intelligence. But I think that just means we've got to figure out, how do we continue to grow? How do we use AI as a way to make us more effective? And so we talked earlier in our conversation here about how we can use AI to create first drafts of our systems. Well, that's a great use of AI. That's not going to make you obsolete, but now it's going to enable you to use more of your systems thinking skills, more of your strategy skills to figure out what's the best structure for the system. What's the ultimate objective of the system? How does this system fit within all the other systems that we have in the organization? How can we get all these systems to work together more seamlessly than they do today? So there's lots of things that we can do that require a higher level of thinking and a higher level of skill sets and capabilities, that when we use the technology to automate and systematize the things that don't really require our level of human knowledge and thinking today, let's use the technology to automate that as best we can so that we can continue to elevate and do the things that make us human and do the things that only humans can do.
Absolutely.
All right, Amy, is there anything else that you want to add here as it relates to systems that we may not have touched on, or anything you want to reinforce that we have touched on?
Yeah, let's just go through those 5 steps again. I actually created an acronym, what streamlined operation strategy. It's your SOS to be able to start this process. And so, you start with the process itself, you move on to the checklist, the system, the delivery, and then ultimately you want to have the training that goes with all of that. And so it's not easy to put systems in place, I will tell you that. But you have a team that should be able to help you with this. Having the right people in place is so important to this as well, that are excited and eager to help make your firm more efficient and just deliver a better, consistent experience to your clients, so that you are indispensable to them.
Excellent. All right, Amy, it's great to catch up with you here today to talk about systems. And for each of you listening, if you want to learn more here, you can go to belayadvisor.com and get information about this. We've also got a couple of the checklists that Amy had mentioned here. We'll have those available in the show notes that you can find there on the website. So appreciate it. And if you want to learn more, just look us up there, get in touch with us, and we can connect you with Amy if if you want to talk about coaching or if you want to talk about systems in some more details. So again, Amy, appreciate it.
My pleasure.